Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be doing a review on the Ryzen 9 7950X3D. So I did manage to pick up this CPU on launch day. You can see it right here. Well, here's the packaging. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be comparing it with the standard Ryzen 9 7950X CPU, which I have been using as my main streaming PC and video editing PC, so kind of like a prosumer workstation. If you want to see productivity benchmarks and how these two CPUs compare, stay tuned for another video because I will be looking at that in future content. And then the third CPU that we are going to be comparing it with is Intel's 13900K, so the i9 with the 32 threads. So that is the 32 thread equivalent from Intel. So without further ado, let's get into this. So for the test system, I am testing with Windows 10 Professional version 22H2. A lot of the reviewers that you've seen so far are testing on Windows 11 based PCs, so this is going to be relevant for those that are still on Windows 10 and just don't want to go to Windows 11 for whatever reason. So you might find this info valuable in that regard. On top of that, I am testing all three of these CPUs with a Noctua NHD15 cooler. So this is an air cooler. I have featured this in the install video on the channel for, not only the 13900K build, but the 7700X and now the 7950X3D. So there's going to be that as the cooling system, because I think this is a really good air cooler. It's a high-end air cooler, probably one of the best ones, typically similar to a 280 AIO. Somewhere in that ballpark in terms of its cooling performance. And then the other thing that I have done is I am running 64 gigabytes of memory. So we've got G.Skill Ripjaws S5. So those are the dual rank DIMMs running at the XMP profile, 5600 megahertz. This is SK Hynix RAM. So you can see the cast latency is going to be 30, 36, 36, 89. For the SSD, I'm using an Inland Prime PCI Gen 3 SSD for all the comparisons done. So I wanted to, use the same SSD. I have multiple Prime Gen 3 drives, so it was relatively easy to replicate the results across three different test systems. And then for the PSU, I'm using the MSI Meg AI 1300p ATX 3.0 PCI Gen 5. You can see a picture of it there. So I did an unboxing and overview of this power supply last year when it launched, as well as a how to upgrade to this power supply in a previous video. So if you want to see that content, check that out in the description. So the tests are done at stock configuration with power limits enforced. So what that means is that I'm not running the motherboards in unlimited power. I'm enforcing the actual specifications for power limits 1 and 2 for Intel. I'm also enforcing AMD's power limits for the Ryzen CPUs. So I think this gives a good idea of how to make these run energy efficient without sacrificing too much on performance, while also being a very, very reliable and stable machine for 24/7 operation, for example, or for live streaming, because as I've said in my live stream videos, I live stream for multiple hours, typically like 3, 4, maybe sometimes 5 hours or more, and having my CPU run in a very efficient manner prevents things like the room heating up, as well as just wasting a lot of electricity for very little gain. So without further ado, let's get into the benchmarks. So the first game that we're looking at is Borderlands 3. Borderlands 3 is using the Unreal Engine 4, 1080p, 237 FPS, and 1440 179, and then 104 at 4K. So you can see, compared to the other two CPUs, the X3D variant has a noticeable lead, especially in 1080p, and a slight lead in, well, it's a noticeable lead, but it's a slight lead in 1440p, and then it kind of falls back at 4K, where the GPU tends to be the limiting factor. Next, I tested Godfall. So this is a game that it also uses Unreal Engine 4, but this was one that was an interesting one to test, and I did test it I did multiple runs but in all scenarios, the X3D was actually slower than the Ryzen 9 7950X in the middle here, and then the Intel 13900K. So the 13900K did win out in this one, in this Unreal Engine 4 game. In terms of the scheduling, I basically did all the steps that I showed in the installation video, and then I did not bother to do any sort of lasso or affinity core assignment or any sort of manual scheduling. I didn't touch anything. I let the processor, I let Windows do all the management. I did not disable any of the cores, so it's all 32 threads are active, and I let it run, and these are the results I got. So in this regard, Godfall, UE4, it favors frequency. So Intel wins because it clocks the highest, and then the Ryzen 9 750X tends to clock higher as well. Next, we have Horizon Zero Dawn. So this game utilizes the Decima engine. So this is a very unique game because there's not a whole lot of games that are ported to PC that utilize the Decima engine. Typically, this is something that's used more for PlayStation first-party games. But it is interesting to see the PC results on this title. So we can see that the 3D Vcache does make a difference. Not so much, it's not really that noticeable in the averages or the minimums, but what is quite different is the maximums. So this is interesting. I wanted to include the maximums because it does kind of show you the absolute max that the CPU is allowing the GPU to punch all the way up there. You know, like we're breaking that 400 FPS barrier there. Now I noticed the minimums, however, are better on the Intel CPU. At least the 1080p results are, and then it kind of like trails back. 1440p, they're all really close, and then at 4K, Intel does also have a little bit of an advantage there at 73 FPS on the minimum. But overall, I would say with the air cooler, with the power limits enforced, all three of them perform very similar. There is a slight win at 1080p for the 3D Vcache CPU, and then it just kind of falls back in line with margin of error for the other resolutions. Next, this was probably the weirdest game that I tested. So Forspoken, those of you that watch my live streams regularly, remember when I covered Forspoken at launch. This title is very, very strange. We've kind of joked on stream about this game being the new Crysis, because this game is just incredibly difficult to run unnecessarily compared to how the visual quality is in this game compared to other games like Cyberpunk, for example. It uses the Luminous engine. So the Luminous engine is developed by Square Enix. It is, I think, the same engine that Final Fantasy 15 was based out of. So I don't understand why the performance is kind of all over the place here. One thing that's really strange, or really stands out, is the 7950X actually did better than both Intel and the 3D cache CPU at 1080p. But then as you go up the resolution, you know, then they all kind of fall back in line, but for some reason, the 7950X still managed to win. I don't really know why. I did 3 runs and took the average of all 3, and these are the results. So, kind of a strange game, but this could be the outlier in terms of the Vcache, or, I mean, I would say it favors frequency, but, you know, the Intel loses to the standard Ryzen 9, so it doesn't really indicate that it favors frequency. But I don't know. It's like the scheduling might be a thing here, but we'll see. We'll see when the 7800X 3D comes out, how it runs in this game. Alright, next up we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider is it's getting kind of old now, but I like to include it because it is good to test, to see scaling as you go up the resolutions. So we can see here in this game, in terms of the average, the 3D Vcache and the standard 7950X did tie at 297. And then the minimums, though, it looks like the standard Ryzen actually is doing a little bit better, which was a very interesting observation. I'm not really sure what to make of these results. And then as we look at the 1440p and the 4K results, you know, it just kind of shows like that linear drop in FPS as you go up the resolution stack. So another really strange result here. I would have expected the 3D Vcache to do better in this game, but these are the results that I got with the hardware that I tested it with. Alright, so the next game is Final Fantasy Endwalker. So this is Final Fantasy 14. This is the massive MMO game that was very, very popular. It kind of overtook World of Warcraft back prior to Endwalker releasing back in 2021. And then it's still pretty popular, but I think it has kind of fallen down in popularity over the course of a year or so. The Crystal Tools engine, that's what this is going to be using. So that's the same sort of engine that Final Fantasy 13, that whole trilogy was based off of. So 13 and 14 are derived from the same engine. And the results here show that it does like the V-Cache. So you can see compared to the standard Ryzen CPU, it does do significantly better. It also bests Intel in this title as well. So you can see, 291 for the 1080p result average with a 115 on the minimum. So it had higher minimums at 1080p and 1440p, and then Intel did manage to tie the minimum roughly. Kind of beat it by 1 FPS, 92 versus 91 at 4K. But here we're a lot more GPU bound, so I do feel like the 4K results, the whole purpose of the 4K results here are to kind of show that at that resolution, the GPU definitely becomes the limiting factor in terms of the performance. So, but the 1080p results on this one do show that this MMO does like the Vcache, and if this is anything to go by, that does kind of indicate that games like Star Citizen, for example, and other MMOs or other unoptimized MMOs like those free-to-play Korean MMOs like Black Desert and those other ones could benefit from the Vcache the same way Endwalker has. Alright, and then the last game that I tested was Far Cry 6. So this one uses the Dunia engine. It's relatively modern. This game is not brand new anymore, but it is not super old. Like, it's definitely much more recent than a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for instance. But you can see the results here speak for themselves. Again, this one is right in line with what I kind of expected to see compared to some of those other games that we tested, like Godfall, for instance. But this one does show that the Dunia engine does like that 3D Vcache. So any game like that, Ubisoft type games, that 7800X 3D for gaming is probably going to look pretty good in a month or two from now. Alright, so what does that bring us to the overall results in terms of the average FPS for all of the games that were tested? These are the results. So at 1080p, 235 FPS versus Intel and the standard Ryzen 9 at 223. And then at 1440p, it's still winning, 187 to 183 and 180. And then at 4K, it's kind of weird because, like I was saying earlier, I think the GPU becomes the limiting factor. All three of them are very close. But, the standard Ryzen, for some reason, did manage to win at 4K resolution by a small margin, but it did technically win if you tally the numbers up. So how much faster is the X3D versus the standard 7950X? Well, you can see here at 1080p, it's from the games that I tested at least, with the system specs that I tested, 106%, so 6% faster at 1080p, 2% faster at 1440p, and then it did actually lose by 3% at 4K, so I don't know. I mean, I kind of think the 4K results don't really matter too much for this test. 3%, there is margin of error at that resolution when you're trying to look for CPU bottlenecks, but this is the results that I got. And then how it compared to the Intel i9-13900K. So at 1080p, it was 5% faster, 3% faster at 1440p, and 2% faster at 4K. So the only one that probably is noting is the 1080p result. It's 105, so it's 5% faster than Intel at 1080p, whereas it was 6% faster at 1080p versus the 7950X. So it means that it is typically at the 1080p resolution is outperforming the standard Zen 4 CPU, but then when you compare it to the 3D Vcache CPU from AMD, then the tables kind of turn. and these results kind of show that. So here is the thing that I think is the big elephant in the room when it comes to the Vcache CPU, and is it good for productivity and gaming? You know, AMD's whole narrative of the best of both worlds, if you will. So what I did was I looked at the power consumption while gaming. So I averaged the result using Hardware Info 64, because Hardware Info 64 can tell me the CPU's power consumption. But this is what I got based off of Hardware Info. So with the power limits enforced, this is what I see. So the 7950X3D, while gaming, only uses around 77 watts of power. The 7950X uses 118 watts of power, and the 13900K used 171 watts of power. So what really stands out is the comparison between the X3D and the 13900K, because, you know, we're talking about 100 watts less. So, you know, that about 100 watts difference, and the thing is, this is with the power limits enforced. So, typically, if this was in unlimited power mode, the Intel one could run over 200. So, we've kind of reined it in a little bit to be more efficient. So, it does kind of toggle between, you know, the 125 watt on the power limit 1 and the 254 watt power limit on the upper power limit. But these are the results, and I think this speaks for itself. So, you know, it's faster than both of them at 1080p when we're measuring CPU, and it does slightly win at 1440p as well. You know, 4K is kind of a toss-up, but these energy efficiency numbers speak for themselves, because if I was going to be a live streamer on Twitch, for example, and if I was going to do like an 8-hour stream or some super long stream, rest assured, streaming off of one of these X3Ds, the room's not going to heat up. So, I mean, all the heat in the room is going to be coming from the graphics card, and the CPU is just not really contributing there compared to these other CPUs. So, I think this is kind of a huge win for the energy efficiency on this 3D Vcache CPU. So, to conclude, what are my final thoughts on this CPU? So, in terms of the energy efficiency, it's super good, but it's still excellent for gaming, all things considered, especially at the lower resolution. So if you're a 1080p gamer, this could potentially be a strong contender. However, I don't really recommend this for 1080p gaming because the problem, as noted here in the third bullet point, because of the high price of this CPU, it's typically going to be paired up with a higher resolution monitor, like a 4K monitor, or at least a 1440p monitor. And at those higher resolutions, you lose a lot of that advantage in gaming compared to the other CPUs that we looked at. And because the CPU is more expensive than the other two CPUs, it's not a really good ideal choice for a strictly gaming PC. So I guess that kind of leads me to the fourth bullet point. If you're trying to build a new gaming PC and you're upgrading from a really old DDR3 platform or maybe an old DDR4 platform, and you just want to make the jump to DDR5 because DDR5 has become a lot more affordable in the last several months, I would say wait for the 7800X3D. I think that's probably going to be the best gaming CPU of the year. It's like, yes, you can turn a 7950X3D into a single CCD 7800X3D by disabling one of the CCDs, but I personally would never do that. Why would you spend, you know, a whole lot more money on this just to turn off half of the cores? To me, that doesn't make any sense. Likewise with the 13900K, like I would never buy this just to turn off all 16 E cores just to game with it. Like to me, that just, why would I spend money on this when I could just buy like a 13700K for much less, you know, and get the same gaming performance essentially. So for productivity, the CPU is an excellent choice because of how efficient it is. So if you care about energy efficiency, if you care about not heating up your room, especially if you're live streaming for several hours, you know, this could be a really, really nice choice if you're upgrading to a new DDR5 based platform. So with that said, I guess what I'll say, final words are, if you're a live streamer and you want a cool and quiet system, definitely recommended. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here, guys. I hope you guys found this content useful. And if you have any questions about any of the testing, please leave a comment in the video section down below. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.